Well, hey, everybody. Welcome back to Jericho Road, where in this season, we're looking at the Gospel of Mark and the world of Jesus through the eyes of this Gospel. And in this episode, I want to talk about storms. Now, I want to show you a slide of a storm that blew up on the lake for me a couple years ago in the evening time. Storms can blow up really fast on the Sea of Galilee because it sits in a bowl. It's the lowest freshwater lake on planet Earth. There are mountains all the way around it, and wind will get up in there and roll around, and a storm can happen all of a sudden. In Mark's gospel, there are two of these. In Mark chapter 4, you've got a storm where Jesus is asleep in the boat and wakes up and stills it, revealing his authority even over storms. In Mark chapter 6, there's a different lesson, and that's what we're going to look at today. Well, let me read it to you. I will say this one is a little different than the way Matthew remembers the story. This is Jesus walking on water, where Matthew will tell the story, and it's in Matthew 14, of Peter attempting to walk on water as well. I like the way that Mark remembers this without that detail because it brings us more to a point about Jesus that we might overlook. Hey, let's just read it and see if we can see it in a new way. So this is Mark chapter 6, beginning with the 45th verse. Immediately, he made his disciples get into the boat and go ahead to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. And after saying farewell to them, he went up to the mountain to pray. When evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the land. And when he saw they were straining at the oars against an adverse wind, he came toward them early in the morning, walking on the sea. He intended to pass them by. But when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out, for they all saw him and they were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." And then he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased. And they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. Well, right away, a few details jump out in the story and can give us a lesson. First of all, we're told in the first verse of this story, verse 45, that immediately he forced them, or he made them get into the boat and go ahead to Bethsaida. The word actually specifically is forced, and it's used also to describe Paul's confinement in a Roman prison in Acts chapter 28. So it's a pretty stern word. I mean, he didn't suggest that they go to Bethsaida. He didn't ask them to go to Bethsaida, but rather he made them almost as if they were under compulsion to go to that part of the lake. And you have to ask the question, why? Why are they forcing them to leave? But a good clue is found in a story that happens right before this one in Mark's gospel. Oftentimes we'll lose the meaning of the story when we have to chop it up into little bits. And so if we read it as a whole, we will see that just before Jesus has fed 5,000 people with a few loaves and fish, which means that Jesus and his disciples could be misused, or their message could be misused. That miracle of the feeding could easily be construed as a free lunch. It could also be construed as a power play for Jesus. I mean, they're looking for someone, a Messiah, which we talked about in episode chapter 7 of this podcast. They're looking for a Messiah to throw the Romans out of Palestine, a general. How about a general who could feed an army with just a few crumbs of bread and a few fish? Jesus knows that it's not time for his identity to be revealed to them in this way. And so he makes them leave this scene before the crowds can do something with them. I think that's as good an explanation as any. And then we're told he went up to the mountain to pray. I'll show you another picture from the Sea of Galilee. This is a little sunset picture. This gives you an idea because this is likely the mountain that Jesus went up over the waters. They're everywhere. The whole bank is full of mountainside because this lake sits so low down into the ground. And so, as I've mentioned, the Sea of Galilee is a bowl, and from the top of the bank, if you will, which would be the mountain, the Sermon on the Mount being the sermon on the bank, or the sermon on this particular mountain would be the sermon on the bank of the lake, you can look out and you can see everything. You can see all the way across. The Sea of Galilee is 7 miles across and 11 miles long. It's just not big. And you can pretty much see everywhere they're going on this northwest shore between Magdala and Bethsaida, where the gospel stories happen. So on this night, he can see them, and he sees that they're already in trouble because one of these storms, just like the one I experienced in the evening in a flash, if you will, one of these storms has got them straining at oars against an adverse wind. I know something about this kind of wind. For the past decade or so, I have taken up the sport of rowing, and not just a rowing machine, but a boat. It's called sculling, or I like to call myself an oarsman of sorts. It started happening when I noticed the sport in Maine, where I go in the summertime to serve a little church up there. And it's a beautiful sport, and you learn the physics of it pretty quickly. And what I mean by this is that when you row a boat, you don't need a lot of wind, mainly because you become a trimaran. Your oars touch the water, and you're stabilized that way, and you're sitting on the boat, and you're sitting flat, but you become a sail. In the wind will blow you anywhere you want to go. And a scull, like the boat that Jesus would have rowed, Jesus' friends would have rowed, didn't have a centerboard. So any kind of wind resistance would blow them in an opposite direction if they were straining against an adverse wind. I have my own story. It's actually terrifying. I went out on the off the shore in Maine to a little backshore place. It was where a marsh comes in and a river, but it was about a half mile from the boathouse. And a cold front came across the water. I noticed the ripples at first, and I thought, well, this is kind of neat. It's pretty and it feels good. Little ripples on the water, but suddenly it became a wind, and I was straining against it, and I couldn't get back. And it took over an hour, which should have only taken 10 minutes. It took an hour to get the boat back, and there were waves, and they were crashing over the bow of the scull, and I was terrified. And I thought about this story of Jesus and his authority to still storms, and I sure did lift up a prayer. I do remember, though, finally returning to the boathouse exhausted, and the boathouse manager said, "I always had you, Rich." He had binoculars in his hand. He said, "I always had you. I would have come and gotten you if you were in any danger." And I thought about God's love and God's power to save us even in the middle of storms. Well, let's return to this storm. I'd like to show you the model of a boat that Jesus and his friends would have ridden in. This is a model of a fishing boat that's based on a wooden hull that was found in the mud during a drought at the Sea of Galilee in 1986. It's also based on a mosaic that was found in the town of Magdala, where Mary Magdalene is from. It's a pretty close recreation of that boat. And like I said, there's no centerboard, but there are oars on each side. And so the disciples were rowing, but they were rowing in the wrong direction because they were getting blown all over the place in that little bitty craft. They were terrified. And by looking at the verse that follows this story, we can even see where they went. I'll show you a Google Earth picture of the lake just for a second to show you the red line there is where the boat went. The yellow line goes all the way from Magdala to Bethsaida. So if you sort of look to the left and go to the right would be where they're trying to go. The red line is where they went, which is 3 miles backwards. So it was quite a storm. And here comes the miracle. You know, there are a couple points that I want to make when you think about Jesus walking on the water. First of all, Jesus didn't perform miracles to prove his existence. He wasn't about that. Jesus didn't walk on water to say, "See, I'm Superman." I mean, that was really not the point of that at all. He was walking out there to save them. He could see that they were in trouble, and he was headed out there to make sure that they were going to be okay. That's the first point. Second thing I want to tell you is that this was probably not the scene that we've imagined from our Sunday school days growing up. For starters, this is not flat water. As I've said, I've got my own story as an oarsman. Wind can blow you the wrong direction, but also with that wind comes waves, and it's terrifying to be in a boat with those kinds of waves. It would also be terrifying to see Jesus coming over waves like this, hopping from cap to cap, slapping water down and moving out there. They thought they saw a ghost. More specifically, I think they thought that they were going to be ghosts soon when they died out there on that water. So Jesus is not only saving them here, he's also doing something else in his walking, because we're told in this little detail that he intended to pass them by. Did you catch that? Jesus walked toward them intending to pass them by, which has to bring deeper meaning to this miracle than simply a trick to prove his existence. In Genesis chapter 1 and 2, and I have a version of this from a Hebrew Bible named Robert Alter. This is a masterwork, if you will. It's a translation of the Hebrew Bible that was just completed a year or so ago. And from the original language, this is the way he writes the very beginning. This is literally page 1 of our Bibles. When God began to create heaven and earth, And the earth then was welter and waste and darkness over the deep, and God's breath hovered over the waters. God said, let there be light. God's breath hovered over the waters. That word hovered also means brood, like an eagle would brood over their young to protect it. God's breath would brood over the waters, protect them. And so what we're beginning to see here with Jesus walking on the water is no mere trick to prove his existence, but rather a reenactment of what God has always done, which is to move over the face of the deep and to protect us, to create and also to brood to make sure that we are safe. And yet there's even still more here. I believe that Jesus intended to pass them by because Jesus was doing what God has always done. And remember, we read these stories of the Bible not because we're merely interested in first century events or Hebrew history, although those are fascinating. We are students of the Bible because if God did something once, God will do it again. And God was doing something again over the waves of this tumultuous storm that he had done before. And it happened in Exodus chapter 33. Now, I'll recap the story before I read it to you. What happens is that God gave Moses 10 commandments, but he was gone up on the mountain for a while. And while he was gone, God's people fell into some debauchery and idolatry. They built a golden calf and they danced around it. And I want to remind you that the purpose of a golden calf in the Old Testament was a rain god. They wanted something they could see. They were hedging their bets. They forgot to be different in the way that the Bible asked them to be different. And Moses was so enraged that he broke the tablets of the law. But in time, he asked for a second chance. God granted it. God said, I will do this for you again. I'll give you the law again, and we'll start over again, and I'll give you another try, but with condition. And this is what he says. So it's Exodus chapter 33. And it's verse 17. The Lord said to Moses, I will do the very thing that you've asked, for you have found favor in my sight, and I know you by name. Then Moses said, show me your glory, I pray. And God said, I will make all my goodness pass before you, and will proclaim you before the name the Lord. And I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and I will show mercy on whom I will show mercy. But, he said, you cannot see my face, for no one shall see me and live. And the Lord continued, see, there's a place by me where you shall stand on the rock. And while my glory passes by, I will put you in a cleft of the rock, and I will cover you with my hand until I've passed by, and I will take away my hand, and you'll see my back, but my face shall never be seen. I'll do this thing for you, but you cannot see me. You can't look at me and live. And so God passed him by, just like Jesus intended to pass them by. This is a reenactment, if you will, or a return of God's glory over the face of the waters. Did you notice here where Moses asked to see God's glory, but he says, I will show you my goodness? He wants to see glory, but instead he sees goodness. He sees God's ability to bestow grace. He sees the goodness of God, which is the love of God for him. Moses wants to see something flashy. Instead, God shows him something good. Well, we see the same thing with the disciples, right? God's people are deeply flawed. He has to make them leave the scene of the feeding of the 5,000 so that they don't get into any kinds of trouble. And they'll continue to get into trouble again and again. But God works with people, and God moves across the face of the waters for us, even with our flaws. And if you go back to the Exodus story, we're told that God put Moses into the cleft of the rock so that he would be safe as he passed them by because he couldn't see his face. He puts him and he covers him with his hand. And in the Hebrew language, there's a very specific word for that hand. He covers him with his palm, which is the tenderest part of the hand. I was also thinking about our own Christian iconography, about the wounds of Christ happening in the palm, or as I like to say, on the darkest of our nights, we will find that the hand holding ours has a nail print within them. But in this Exodus story, God holds Moses with the palm of his hand so that he's gently protected as he moves by. God is still gentle, God is still brooding, God is still protecting, even in the midst of storms. I like to say to our people here at St. Luke's, to be alive means that at any given time we are in a crisis or coming out of a crisis or headed into a crisis. At any given time, there is a storm in our lives, and yet God will save us, and God will be with us, and God will be gentle. Now, there's still one other perspective here. I mean, the first perspective is that of Jesus. He intended to pass them by because he is revealing to them that God is doing what God always does, which is to brood over the face of the waters and to still storms. There's that. But there's also the perspective of the disciples, and this is the personal side of this thing. They're scared to death. Just like I was scared to death on the waters off the coast of Maine. Wind is scary when you're in a boat. Wind is really scary when you're in a rowboat and they're straining and they're going in the wrong direction. So Jesus says this to them, and they think he's a ghost, right? And they think that this is going to be the end for them all. And Jesus says, "Take heart, it is I." Now, again, this would be familiar to them. I want you to recall with me that people living in the Galilee in the first century had almost 100% literacy rates, which means that they read the Bible every Sabbath, and which means that they knew the stories much better than we did, which means that they lived the stories much more than we do. But when Jesus said, "Take heart, it is I," that would be very familiar to them. First of all, when Moses asked God to reveal his name, God said, I am who I am. That happens in the book of Exodus. Later, in a story from their own exile, the time some 600 years before Jesus' birth, when they lost everything. They lost their temple, they lost their home, they were stuck off in a faraway land. God would say to the prophet Isaiah words of comfort, and God would reveal God's own identity and God's own name. And I'll read two of these to you. Isaiah 41, beginning with the fourth, is the fourth verse, Isaiah 41:4. I'll read it to you. "Who has performed and done this, calling the generations from the beginning? I, the Lord, am first, and I will be the last." So what you see here is that I is the name of God. I've got another one, Isaiah 43, verses 10 and 11. "You are my witnesses, says the Lord, and my servant whom I've chosen, so that you may know and believe me and understand that I am he. Before me no God was formed, nor shall there be any after me. My servant whom I have chosen, and understand that I am he." Take heart, it is I, is revealing to the disciples in the storm that Jesus is God. At the first storm, they just saw he had the authority that they'd never seen before. Now they're beginning to realize, or it's dawning on them, or it will dawn upon them, that this is divine authority. Jesus is doing for them what God always does for us, right? Brood and protect and pass them by. God was with them, even way out there. And then finally, at the end of the story, we're told that the disciples' hearts were hardened. They couldn't understand. They couldn't see, which is a repeating theme in the Gospel of Mark, which is why he has to keep his identity secret, because they'll misuse him, which is also a recurring theme in our own lives as well. How often is God at work all around us, moving us, guiding us, saving us, and yet we can't see? I remember from seminary a sermon that I heard where the preacher mentioned that he was walking on the beach somewhere in the Atlantic where they have these big sea turtles, and sea turtles will get turned around and they go into the dunes, and if they don't go into the water, they'll die. And they would pay these teenagers to ride up and down the beach in four-wheelers and tie a chain around these huge mammoth creatures, right, and drag them out into the water. And this preacher saw some teenagers dragging the sea turtle across the sand on his back. The turtle was squalling and tongue hanging out and making all kinds of noise, which caused the preacher to reflect, sometimes we don't know if we're being saved or we're being killed. Well, the same is true here. They were terrified. They thought they were seeing a ghost, and yet God was with them, and God will be with us still. Remember what I said. We may be headed into a crisis. We may be in a crisis. We may be coming out of a crisis. But God will be there, even in the midst of storms. So that's our lesson for today, guys. I hope that gave you a new insight into Jesus and the world of Jesus, and I look forward to seeing you again. Thanks.